The foreign policy of intervention influences the daily lives of all Americans. Some examples can be found in the daily lives. The majority of the U.S. budget has been spent on military defense, which is paid for by taxpayers. Travel has become increasingly restrictive and difficult since 9/11. Now we have to wait in long lines at security, have our baggage searched, and occasionally get patted down. Troops fighting in the Middle East, our friends, our families, people we know and love, have returned traumatized by PTSD. These are some of the consequences of intervention in the Middle East. Yet still, there is an urgent threat rising in the Middle East in the form of religious organizations hidden among civilians. These past few decades have brought about a new warfare, which introduces new moral dilemmas and threatens the lives of civilians. How a nation addresses this situation is one of the most crucial issues of this decade. American democracy requires the knowledge of its citizens for every portion of its policy to function. For this reason, it is imperative that Americans define foreign policy and investigate its effectiveness. Americans must ask integral questions, such as, what are the effects of American intervention in the Middle East? Does American intervention conflict with American identity? What is the purpose of intervention, and does that purpose have moral and beneficial justifications? Through answering these questions, Americans may be able to produce a positive change in foreign policy and influence a brighter future. The foreign policy of America has taken many shapes since its beginning. The Monroe Doctrine, founded in December 2nd, 1823, defended American isolationism by preventing European involvement in the American sphere of influence. This helped define American isolationism as abstaining from political or economic entanglements with other nations. The Bush Doctrine has three main points, which helps to define interventionism. They are preemption, acting alone, and extending freedom. Through this, interventionism is the interference for the purpose of defense, or to promote one nation's moral standard over another, oftentimes without the support of other powers. Non-interventionism is abstaining from political alliances and having no political interference with other nations. This is given to us by George Washington's farewell address, wherein he says, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations and to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed entanglements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none, or very remote relation. Hence she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns." The farewell address and the Monroe Doctrine were the primary sources for American foreign policy up until the World Wars. After this, a new foreign policy began, due to rising nationalism from World War II and the ideology of democratizing the world. America began to fight in the East, fighting in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and began to be known as the enforcer of freedom. Many modern governments within the Middle East legislate Islamic law and Sharia law, which includes criticism of Islam as punishable by death and innumerable human rights violations. American intervention in these Middle Eastern governments began in 1949 when a CIA coup ousted the elected government of Syria. America's economic involvement has caused many complications. In 1954, the Consortium Oil Agreement opened up Iranian oil to the world. This allowed America to become dependent on Iran for oil and caused intervention, which caused the OPEC oil embargo of 1973. The complicated history and relationship between the Middle East and the U.S. and the effects from the foreign policy of isolationism to interventionism after World War II defined the era of new war and demonstrated the effects of non-interventionism on the world theater. The current policy of interventionism has failed, and it has harmed American interest as well as causing instability in the Middle East. For this reason, we must change our foreign policy to non-interventionism. American intervention for the purpose of promoting democracy is tyrannical, and the self-righteousness of this produces negative effects. American intervention in the Middle East has become the arbitrary, unrestrained exercise of power and despotic abuse of authority which defines tyranny. The culture, religion, and history of the Middle East are opposed to the ideals and political concerns of America, and involvement in this culture provides harms to both. In America, all people are encouraged to practice their rights to religious freedoms and to pursue happiness, and violation of this in the Middle East are directly opposed to the very roots of American government. The current American foreign policy of interventionism is inconsistent with American heritage. America should utilize the foreign policy of non-interventionism in the Middle East because, with exception to cases of non-preemptive defense, because interventionism has failed. The culture and religion and history of the Middle East are directly opposed to the ideals and political concerns of America, and involvement in this culture provides harms to both. Some examples can be found that demonstrate inconsistencies between Western and Eastern values. One is in Iran, where 3 pastors were charged and could face the death penalty for practicing Christianity. Another is given to us by the Human Rights Watch, who said that in 2014 in Iran, suicide attacks, car bombs, and assassinations killed more than 12,000 people. And in the armed conflict in the Anbar province has placed more than 500,000 people. Violence in the Middle East has been spurred on through hatred of American intervention and offense to America's culture, religion, and government. Intervening in the culture and tradition of the Middle East has produced hatred towards America and caused danger and turmoil within Middle Eastern nations and Western alike. Therefore, America should adopt non-interventionalism because it will cause this hatred to cease and allow America to be secure. In America, all people are encouraged to practice their rights to religious freedoms and to pursue happiness, and violations of these rights in the Middle East are opposed to the very roots of American government. America's involvement does not produce good, because that is not the goal of a government. A government who takes an active role in enforcing morals on the world is neglecting a government's duty to protect and support its citizens. Withdrawal in the Middle East will create domestic stability, because it will reduce debt, cut defense spending, and dependence on foreign nations for resources, and allow the U.S. to focus on more important domestic issues. Military spending in 2015 accounted for 55% of all federal spending. That in itself does not appear to be an issue, but it does demonstrate how intervention has unnecessarily cost American taxpayers. And since involvement has become ineffective, it is a waste of our money. Private organizations instead should should take over the duty for humanitarian aid, and the government should only support them through resources and funding. The current American foreign policy of interventionism is inconsistent with American heritage. America began as a non-interventionist nation, and the switch to interventionist is inconsistent with the intentions of the Founding Fathers. America, when revolting from the English, broke from the imperialist and colonialist policies and opposed the intrusion of this policy, which more closely resembles the current interventionist policy, as it disregards the will of a large population. Individuals possess the right to determine how they are governed, but intervention robs those people of their right. American rhetoric says that intervention is a way to spread freedom. However, American intervention has overthrown governments voted in by the people of the Middle East. Intervention has also caused immoral alliances with people in the Middle East, and has produced even more evils within the Middle East, which is against the intention of the Founding Fathers, against American tradition, and against our morals. One strong argument against interventionism is that America began as an isolationist nation out of necessity, and now that America is a world power, it has a moral obligation to provide humanitarian aid. However, current humanitarian aid has produced internal turmoil and has strengthened terrorist organizations within the Middle East. Sabal al-Naziri, the professor of the Department of Political Science at York University, said that the U.S. destruction of the Iraqi state caused Iraq to be dependent on the U.S. and allowed the U.S. to push for concessions. Without a stable government, then a nation is vulnerable to insurgents and security problems. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said that the 1953 U.S. overthrow of Iran's prime minister was a setback for Iran's development and has caused resentment to this day. Intervention in foreign nation has failed and is unethical. It is not America's duty to intervene, but instead is America's duty to respect the choices of the people within the Middle East, as our founding fathers had wished for us and as God has established for mankind. The way a nation addresses the current world affairs will shape the future of the nation, both internally and externally. For that reason, it is imperative that all nations understand the drastic state of the Middle East. Although America has a moral duty to right the wrongs of intervention, its ultimate goal should be withdrawal from the Middle East and to adopt the foreign policy of non-interventionism, the original foreign policy established by our founding fathers. Constant analysis is necessary to guard a nation from producing lasting negative effects. And this is a responsibility for all people, but especially American citizens, because they have a greater power to put foreign policy under continuous scrutiny. The history of the involvement in the Middle East demonstrates a dangerous trend of negative impact from intervention and demonstrates how intervention is inconsistent and is a violation of America's role and national identity.